Before we talk about some of the most brutal execution methods in history, we need to answer a simple question. Why did people watch them? You might imagine that seeing an execution would be something most people wanted to avoid. Today, if someone announced that an execution would happen in the town square at noon, most people would probably find somewhere else to be. Maybe at home, maybe watching videos online, maybe doing literally anything else. But for much of history, public executions attracted huge crowds. People traveled long distances to see them. Vendors sold food nearby. Families attended together. Children often watched. In some places, it felt almost like a festival. Strange as that sounds to us today, public executions served an important purpose for rulers. They were meant to send a message. A very loud message. The message was simple. Do not do what this person did. Long before television, newspapers, radio, or social media, governments had very few ways to communicate with large numbers of people at once. But a public execution? That got everyone's attention. Imagine living in a medieval town. Most people cannot read. News travels slowly. Life follows the rhythm of farming, markets, and church bells. Then one morning, officials announce that a criminal will be executed in the town square. Suddenly everyone knows. People talk about it for days before it happens. Rumors spread. Stories grow larger with every telling. By the time execution day arrives, the entire town is curious. And that curiosity was exactly what rulers wanted. Because when people gathered to watch, they were also watching the power of the state. The king's power. The lord's power. The city's power. The message was clear. The government could punish anyone who broke its laws. And it could do so very publicly. In many societies, punishment was not just about removing criminals. It was about creating fear. Not panic. Not terror. Just enough fear to make people think twice. A thief watching another thief being punished might decide that stealing was no longer worth the risk. At least that was the theory. Whether it actually worked is another question. History is full of criminals who apparently never got the memo. But rulers believed public punishment was an effective tool. And they used it often. There was also another reason executions became public events. People were curious. Humans have always been curious. Sometimes wonderfully curious. Sometimes awkwardly curious. And sometimes curious about things that are a little dark. Public executions offered something rare. Drama. A real-life story unfolding in front of a crowd. There was a crime. A trial. A sentence. And finally, a dramatic ending. For people living in times with very few forms of entertainment, this could become a major event. That may sound uncomfortable to modern ears. But entertainment looked very different in the past. Many medieval villages had no theaters, no cinemas, no television, no streaming services asking if you are still watching after 3 episodes. Public spectacles drew attention because there simply were not many alternatives. Crowds gathered for tournaments, religious festivals, markets, and executions. All of these events broke the routine of daily life. Some execution days attracted thousands of people. Visitors arrived from nearby towns. Merchants sold food and drinks. Some spectators even treated the event as a social gathering. It sounds shocking today, but to many people at the time, it felt normal. Religion also played an important role. Many societies believed crime was not only an offense against the law, it was an offense against moral order, against God, against the gods, against the natural balance of the world. Punishment was often viewed as a way to restore that balance. In medieval Europe, for example, religious leaders sometimes supported harsh punishments because they believed justice protected society. People often saw executions as moral lessons. The condemned person became an example, a warning, a living sermon that ended in a very permanent way. Officials frequently encouraged prisoners to confess publicly before their deaths. The crowd would listen. The criminal would admit wrongdoing. Then punishment followed. The hope was that everyone watching would learn from the experience. Whether they learned wisdom or simply learned to avoid getting caught is difficult to know. Probably a bit of both. Public executions also helped rulers appear strong. This was especially important during times of instability. Imagine a king facing rebellion, or a city dealing with rising crime. Showing strength could discourage future challenges. A public execution demonstrated that authority remained in control. Even when governments were weak behind the scenes, public displays could create an image of power. An image mattered. In some cases, rulers deliberately made punishments more dramatic. Not because it was necessary, but because dramatic punishments attracted attention. Attention created fear. Fear encouraged obedience. At least in theory. Of course, public executions did not always go according to plan. Sometimes crowds sympathized with the condemned person. Sometimes executions went wrong. Sometimes spectators became angry. There are records of crowds cheering for prisoners instead of officials. There are even cases where public opinion turned executed criminals into folk heroes. That was definitely not what authorities intended. Imagine spending weeks organizing a public warning only to have people leave saying, "You know, I kind of liked that guy." History can be unpredictable. Over time, attitudes slowly began to change. By the 1700s and 1800s, more people started questioning public executions. Some argued they were cruel. Others argued they encouraged violence rather than preventing it. Many observers noticed that crowds often treated executions like entertainment instead of serious moral lessons. That worried reformers. If the goal was to promote order and virtue, was a cheering crowd really accomplishing that? Gradually, many governments moved executions away from public spaces. The events became private. Walls replaced town squares. Witnesses became limited. The spectacle faded. But for thousands of years before that change, public executions remained one of the most powerful tools governments possessed. They were part punishment, part warning, part political theater, and part public event. As strange as it seems today, entire societies built traditions around watching justice unfold in front of a crowd. And as we move into the next chapter, we will explore one of the most infamous execution methods ever created. A punishment so feared that its very name still carries a sense of dread thousands of years later. The Romans called it crucifixion, and they turned it into one of the most terrifying warnings the ancient world had ever seen. As the sun rose over the Roman world, travelers moving along busy roads often encountered reminders of Rome's power. The Roman Empire stretched across enormous distances. It covered lands in Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Millions of people lived under Roman rule. Different languages were spoken. Different gods were worshipped. Different traditions shaped daily life. Keeping such a huge empire together was not easy. Rome had armies, governors, laws, and taxes. But it also relied on something less pleasant. Not constant fear. Not the kind that kept people awake every night. Instead, Rome wanted people to understand that challenging imperial authority could carry severe consequences. One of the most famous examples of that message was crucifixion. Today, the word is known around the world. It appears in history books, religious texts, films, and documentaries. Yet many people are surprised to learn that the Romans did not invent it. Forms of crucifixion existed before Rome rose to power. Earlier civilizations used related methods as punishments, but the Romans adopted the practice and turned it into one of the most recognizable punishments in ancient history. In many ways, the Romans were experts at organization. They organized roads. They organized armies. They organized governments. And unfortunately, they organized punishments too. For Roman officials, crucifixion served a very specific purpose. It was not simply about removing a criminal. It was about making a statement. The punishment was usually reserved for people whom Rome considered serious threats. Rebels, pirates, runaway slaves, and others viewed as enemies of public order often faced the harshest penalties. Interestingly, Roman citizens were often protected from this punishment. Social status mattered greatly in the ancient world. The same crime could result in very different treatment depending on who committed it. That may seem unfair to modern audiences. Then again, many people throughout history probably looked around and thought exactly the same thing. One reason crucifixion became so well known was its visibility. Roman authorities often placed executions in locations where many people would see them. Busy roads worked especially well. Travelers entering a city could immediately see a powerful reminder of Roman authority. No official speech was necessary. The message spoke for itself. Rome wanted obedience, and Rome wanted everyone to know it. The empire faced frequent challenges throughout its history. There were local uprisings, political disputes, border conflicts, rebellions by conquered peoples. Maintaining control over such a vast territory required more than military strength. It required symbols. Public punishment became one of those symbols. To Roman leaders, visible justice helped reinforce the idea that the state remained strong and stable. Of course, not everyone agreed with Roman rule. History is full of people who resisted powerful empires. One famous example came in the 1st century BCE. After a large slave uprising led by the gladiator Spartacus, Roman authorities moved quickly to reassert control. The rebellion had frightened many Roman leaders. Although the revolt was eventually defeated, officials wanted to make sure similar uprisings would be discouraged in the future. Events like this reveal how Roman punishments often had political goals. The audience was not only the person being punished. The audience was everyone else. Farmers, merchants, soldiers, travelers, entire communities. Rome wanted those observers to remember what they had seen. The punishment became part of a broader strategy of control. At the same time, daily life in the Roman Empire was surprisingly sophisticated. Many cities had public baths, libraries, aqueducts, markets filled with goods from distant lands. People debated politics, attended festivals, and followed sporting events. The empire was capable of remarkable achievements, yet it could also be extremely harsh. This combination often surprises modern readers. We sometimes imagine civilizations as either enlightened or brutal. The reality is usually more complicated. Ancient societies could produce beautiful art while enforcing severe laws. They could build magnificent structures while carrying out punishments we find disturbing today. Humans have always been complicated creatures. History rarely fits into neat categories. Crucifixion also became deeply connected to religion through the story of Jesus of Nazareth. Because Christianity grew into one of the world's largest religions, the image of the cross gained enormous significance. Over time, what had once been associated primarily with punishment became one of the most recognized religious symbols on earth. This transformation is one of history's most remarkable examples of how symbols can change. An object connected to state power eventually became linked to faith, hope, and spiritual meaning for billions of people. That shift took centuries, but it changed the way much of the world viewed the cross forever. As centuries passed, crucifixion gradually disappeared from most regions under Roman influence. Changing governments, changing values, and changing legal systems all played a role. The Roman Empire itself eventually transformed and fragmented. New kingdoms emerged, new laws developed, new ideas about punishment took shape. Yet the memory of crucifixion remained. Writers recorded it, religious traditions preserved it, historians studied it, and thousands of years later, people still discuss it when examining the ancient world. In many ways, crucifixion tells us less about death and more about power. It reveals how governments communicated authority before modern technology. It shows how public punishment could become political theater. And it reminds us that empires often relied on symbols as much as armies. For Rome, the goal was never simply punishment. The goal was obedience. The goal was stability. The goal was making sure that anyone considering rebellion would think twice. Whether that strategy truly worked is a question historians continue to debate. But one thing is certain: few punishments left a larger mark on history. And as we continue our journey through the world's most feared execution methods, we will encounter another practice that became closely tied to terror, reputation, and the power of rulers. A punishment that turned entire landscapes into warnings. Next, we travel into the dark history of impalement,